April 1942. The city pulsed with life, streets crowded with soldiers, factories running day and night, families certain that their homeland was safe. Japan believed it was untouchable. Its empire stretched across the Pacific. Its navy had crushed Pearl Harbor just months before. To the Japanese people, the war felt distant, victory already written. But far out at sea, beyond the horizon, an American aircraft carrier carried a secret no one in Tokyo could imagine. Planes too large for its deck, crews prepared for a mission with no return, and a commander who knew that success could change the course of the war, or end in disaster. This was not just another military strike, it was a daring gamble, a move so bold, so impossible, that even American commanders questioned if it could work. Because the plan was simple and suicidal. Take giant B-25 bombers, meant for long runways, and launch them from the narrow deck of a carrier. Fly hundreds of miles to strike Tokyo, then escape somehow without enough fuel, without a safe landing, without guarantees of survival. And yet, they tried, against the odds, against reason, against fear. The result would shake Japan to its core. For the first time, the enemy would feel the thunder of war on its own soil. December 7, 1941. A calm Sunday morning in Hawaii turned into a nightmare. Japanese planes, hundreds of them, roared out of the sky. Torpedoes slammed into battleships. Bombs tore through airfields. Within 2 hours, the mighty U.S. Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. America shocked. America angry. America wounded. More than 2,000 lives lost. Battleships sunk. Aircraft destroyed before they could even take off. The nation that believed it was safe behind oceans now felt exposed, vulnerable, and humiliated. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. And he was right. The Japanese celebrated. They believed America would hesitate, perhaps even retreat from the Pacific. Their empire stretched wide from China to the Philippines, from Malaya to the islands of the Pacific. Tokyo's leaders thought they had broken America's will in one savage strike. But the truth was different. America's will was not broken, it was burning. The people demanded action. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen wanted revenge. Yet here was the problem. America was not ready. Its navy crippled. Its air power scattered. Its bases stretched thin. How do you hit back when the enemy is thousands of miles away across the ocean? In Washington, military leaders wrestled with the question. They needed a strike, not just for military value but for morale. Something bold, something daring, something that would show the world that America was not defeated. It wasn't about sinking ships or destroying factories. It was about sending a message to Japan, and a message to the American people. But what kind of strike could even reach Japan? The Pacific was vast. Japan had fortified its islands. Long-range bombers could not make the trip from American bases, and no fleet could sail close enough without being spotted. The challenge seemed impossible. Still, the search for a plan continued. In the dark rooms of the Pentagon, an idea began to form. An idea so radical, so unlikely, that many officers dismissed it outright. But to a desperate nation, even the impossible was worth trying. America needed more than strategy. It needed hope. It needed courage. It needed a mission that would lift spirits and prove that Japan was not beyond reach. This was the beginning of the daring plan that would soon send American bombers into the skies over Tokyo, the plan that would later be called the Doolittle Raid. They called it reckless. They called it madness. But when you have nothing left to lose, madness can look like a bold answer. After Pearl Harbor, commanders in Washington argued about how to hit back. Land bases were too far. Battleships could not reach the Japanese home islands without risk. Long-range options failed the test of distance. Then a strange idea surfaced. Use an aircraft carrier as a launch pad. Not for fighters, but for medium bombers, the bulky B-25 Mitchell. These planes needed long runways, not the narrow deck of a carrier. No one had tried this. The thought broke aviation rules. The Army Air Corps and the U.S. Navy were different worlds. Their chains of command and cultures rarely matched. The Army wanted long-range aviation. The Navy controlled the sea. For the plan to work, they had to cooperate closely and secretly. That level of teamwork was rare, but urgency forced them together. Engineers and pilots tested limits. Could a B-25 lift off across a short deck while the carrier pitched in rough seas? Could it climb quickly enough to clear the carrier's island and spray? Could it carry enough fuel and bombs to reach Japan and still have fuel to escape? The problems were technical and deadly. To solve them, crews stripped the bombers down. They removed non-essential gear, cut weight, and added extra fuel tanks. Pilots practiced short-field takeoffs on marked airstrips that simulated a carrier deck. They learned to throttle up fast, release brakes at the exact moment, and use the carrier's wind and speed. Procedures were timed and rehearsed, but tests could not mimic the ocean. A carrier deck moves. Waves throw the ship. Wind shifts without warning. The true test was human. Pilots had to trust training, instruments, and nerve. There were many skeptics. Some officers feared a failed launch would crash into other planes on deck. If the fleet was spotted, the whole task force might be attacked. The risks were real. Crew's lives, a carrier, and a mission that might be one way. Secrecy smoothed the edges. Sailors hammered tie-downs at night. Mechanics whispered in dim hangars. Crews practiced under blackout conditions. The carrier deck smelled of oil, salt, and fear. Sailors watched as bombers were chained like beasts, engines quiet but ready, still. The need to hit back kept the plan alive. Some leaders saw the power of surprise. A strike on Tokyo would not only damage installations, it would shatter Japan's sense of safety and lift American morale. If the team could solve the technical problems, the payoff would be huge. So the impossible idea leapt from talk to test field to carrier deck. What started as a wild thought became a detailed plan. Men rehearsed steps they knew might kill them. Between calculation and courage, the impossible became the only option. Every daring mission needs a leader, someone bold enough to take the risk, and calm enough to inspire men to follow. For this mission, that man was James Harold Doolittle. To most of America, Jimmy Doolittle was already a legend. He wasn't just a pilot, he was an aviation pioneer. In the 1920s and 30s, he broke records. He won air races with breathtaking speed. He performed aerobatics that left crowds stunned. He even earned a doctorate in aeronautics, one of the few military men to do so. He knew not only how to fly, but how to push airplanes to their limits. Courage came naturally to him. Doolittle was the kind of man who would climb into an untested plane without hesitation. He believed machines could be mastered, and risks could be calculated. To others, his daring seemed reckless. To him, it was science and skill. When military leaders searched for someone to lead the dangerous raid on Tokyo, Doolittle's name rose quickly. He had the brains, the courage, and the reputation. If anyone could convince men to take part in what many whispered was a suicide mission, it was him. Doolittle didn't flinch when offered the assignment. He accepted it without hesitation. In his mind, the risk was worth it. America needed hope, and if he had to gamble his life to give it, he was ready. But bravery alone wasn't enough. He needed volunteers, pilots, and crews willing to fly bombers from the deck of a carrier. Knowing full well they might never return, Doolittle gathered them quietly. He explained little. He promised only danger, hardship, and sacrifice. And still, men stepped forward. Why? Because Doolittle had a way of inspiring trust. His confidence was infectious. He didn't beg or plead. He simply told them the mission mattered, that America needed them, and that he would be with them, flying the first plane off the deck himself. That was Doolittle's style. He never asked men to do what he wouldn't do himself. Leadership by example, not by words. In the months that followed, Doolittle shaped his crews with quiet determination. He drilled them hard, demanded precision, and reminded them again and again, success would depend on skill and discipline. Every takeoff had to be perfect. Every bomb had to strike. Every mile flown had to count. Behind closed doors, some officers doubted the plan. They thought Doolittle was gambling with men's lives for little reward. But Doolittle ignored the whispers. He understood something deeper. Symbolism mattered. To hit Tokyo even lightly would prove America was still in the fight. To his men, he showed no fear. Inside, he carried the weight of responsibility. If they failed, it would be his failure. If they succeeded, it would be their victory. Jimmy Doolittle was more than a pilot. He was the spark of confidence, the steady hand at the mission sounded impossible on paper, but for Jimmy Doolittle and his men, there was only one way to prepare: practice until the impossible became routine. The B-25 Mitchell was a strong, reliable bomber. It carried bombs across long distances. But there was one problem: it needed long runways. Aircraft carriers had none. The Hornet's flight deck measured less than 500 feet. The B-25 normally needed more than 3,000. How do you bridge that gap? With training. Relentless, secret training. At Eglin Field in Florida, a quiet airbase far from the public eye, Doolittle's crews began their transformation. On the tarmac, Navy officers painted white lines on the concrete to match the exact length of a carrier deck. Pilots now had one chance to get it right. Throttle up. Release brakes. Pull every ounce of power from the engines. Lift off before running out of space. Day after day, the crews practiced. At first, nerves showed. Some pilots pushed too hard, their wheels barely leaving the ground in time. Others misjudged timing, almost running out of room. But failure was not an option. With each attempt, confidence grew. The impossible started to feel possible. It wasn't just the pilots. Every crew member had a role. Bombardiers, navigators, gunners, they all trained to handle emergencies. They studied maps, learned routes, and prepared for crash landings. They knew once they took off, there was no way back. To stretch range, mechanics modified the planes. Bomb bays, crawl spaces, and even the lower turret were stripped to save weight. Extra fuel tanks were installed in every available spot, even in the bomb bay itself. Every gallon mattered. The men joked that they were flying gas tanks with wings. Discipline was harsh. A single mistake could doom the entire mission. Pilots were drilled on precision. They had to master low-level flying, skimming close to the waves to avoid radar. Navigators memorized courses in silence, rehearsing for skies they had never seen. Gunners checked weapons again and again, knowing they might face fighters over Japan. All of this was done in secrecy. The crews were told only what they needed to know. They couldn't write letters home about their training. They couldn't ask questions about the target. They were soldiers rehearsing for a shadow. Despite the secrecy, a bond grew among them. They laughed through exhaustion. They joked about the suicide mission they all suspected. And yet, no one backed out. Not a single man asked to leave. Because the training wasn't just about skill, it was about courage. Every takeoff, every drill, hardened them. Each man knew he was part of something greater. By the time training ended, the crews were ready. They could launch bombers off a runway shorter than a football field. They could fly low and steady, invisible to enemy eyes. And most of all, they could look danger in the face and keep flying. Training for the impossible had turned ordinary crews into the chosen few. Soon, their practice runs would become the real thing on the rolling deck of the USS Hornet, bound for Tokyo. The plan was simple on paper, brutal in practice. Load 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers onto the deck of an aircraft carrier. Sail the carrier close enough to Japan so those medium bombers could reach the islands. Launch in secret at dawn. Fly low across enemy water. Hit Tokyo and other major cities. Then keep going over China, where crews would land, crash, or bail out and hope for rescue. The ship chosen was USS Hornet. She would carry the planes like an odd, deadly parade. Escort ships would surround her, destroyers, cruisers, and one famous carrier sailing nearby to protect the task force. Everyone kept their mouths shut. Secrecy was absolute. Only the men who had to know were told. Letters home were censored. Movements were quiet and careful. The mood on deck was tense and electric. Logistics were a nightmare. B-25s were not meant to sit on a carrier. They were heavy. They needed fuel for a long flight and weight for bombs. Mechanics worked day and night. They lashed the planes down with chains and cables. They stripped every non-essential part to save weight. Extra fuel tanks were installed where they could fit. Pilots checked charts until their eyes blurred. Navigators plotted a route that skirted known enemy patrols and anti-air zones. Every detail mattered. Timing mattered even more. The carriers had to get close enough, but not so close that the fleet was spotted early. The bombers needed to be within range, but the crews wanted a margin for error. Some fuel for mistakes, some fuel for weather, some fuel to find friendly ground in China. The original plan called for a launch point at the edge of range, a calculated risk. It was a thin chance, but it was the only one available on the day. Weather would be a factor. Wind, sea state, and night cover could help or doom the mission. The crews would take off into a world of smoke and waves, trusting their training and their commander. They would fly low to avoid radar and enemy fighters. They would follow exact paths, hit assigned targets, and then keep moving. There was no turning back. The carriers could not recover the bombers. There was no spare runway. The only hope was China, friendly airfields, sympathetic villagers, and hope that crews could make it to safety. The targets were chosen for impact as much as damage. Tokyo would be struck to send a message. Other cities, industrial centers, ports, and military facilities would be hit to show reach and to dent morale. The goal was not massive destruction. It was shock. It was proof that Japan could be reached and punished. Finally, the plan asked for courage. Men were expected to accept near certain danger, to risk capture, injury, or death. They did so anyway. They understood the mission's meaning beyond tactics. This was about hope for a wounded nation. This was about telling America and the world, we will fight back. Everything depended on one moment: the launch. If the fleet was discovered early, the mission might be forced to change. If the weather turned, planes might not take off. If pilots missed their routes, they might run out of fuel over a cold ocean. Still, the plan moved forward. The Hornet steamed west. The men waited. The world held its breath. They called it a mission with no return, not because the pilots were reckless but because the plan left them no real way home. Every man who climbed into a B-25 that day knew the truth. Those bombers were too big to land back on the carrier. The Hornet's deck was a thin strip of steel, perfect for fighters, impossible for medium bombers. Once launched, the planes were committed. There was no turning around, no safe harbor, no warm runway waiting at sea. That reality changed everything. It made every choice heavier. It made every decision count for life or death. Crews trained for precision takeoffs, but they also trained for crashes. They practiced bailing out, opening chutes over ocean, and ditching in icy water. Mechanics showed them how to strip a burning plane to lighten weight. Navigators plotted paths toward friendly airfields in China, but charts could not promise safety. They could only point a desperate way forward. The danger was not just technical, it was human. Men faced the fear of capture. Japan's rules were harsh for downed airmen. Captured crews could face imprisonment, brutal treatment, even execution. That possibility hung in every conversation. Yet the men pressed on. Doolittle accepted the risk first. He volunteered to lead the first plane off the deck. That simple act mattered. Leadership bought trust. If the commander was willing to go first, the crews felt less alone in their fate. Still, knowing their leader would ride the same gamble didn't ease the cold knot in their stomachs. And then there was fuel. The calculations were tight. Extra tanks stretched range, but fuel still limited how far they could fly. Weather could burn fuel faster. Wind, rain, and rough seas could turn a planned route into a fight for survival. Pilots watched gauges like men watching hearts on an operating table. Every inch of needle movement could mean life or death. Morale played its part too. The men joked to hide fear. They sang quietly to calm nerves. They wrote letters they might never send. Some said goodbye in small, private ways. Others simply focused on tasks, checklists, engine starts, pre-flight rituals. Routine became a shield against panic. That the Navy felt the weight of the gamble as well. A carrier steaming close to enemy waters risked attack. If enemy ships or planes found the task force, the whole mission could end in catastrophe and the Hornet might be lost with all hands. Sailors tightened watches. Lookouts skin horizons hour after hour. Each radar blip raised the pulse on deck. Still, everyone agreed on one hard truth. The gamble was necessary. America needed a blow that would lift spirits and force Japan to react. The mission's planners believed the cost if heavy would be worth the message sent. They framed risk as purpose. If men gave their lives for a shot at changing the war's tone, the sacrifice had meaning. So they set a date. They loaded the decks. They chained the planes. And they launched men into an uncertain sky. No guarantees. No safe return. Just a thin hope and the courage to try. April 1942. A cold dawn. Salt on the air. And a carrier dressed not for show but for war. The USS Hornet sat heavy with an impossible cargo. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, chained and lashed across her flight deck like birds trapped for a single, desperate flight. Secrecy wrapped the task force tight. Only the officers and men who needed to know were told the truth. Sailors signed oaths. Mail was censored. Rumors tried to move through the crew, but they died quickly, cut off by orders and silence. The mood on Hornet was quiet, not cheerful. Everyone knew something big was happening. No one knew the full story. Mechanics crawled under wings at night by flashlight. They checked bolts, tightened fuel lines, and taped seams against salt spray. Chains bit into metal where the planes were lashed down. Pilots walked the deck in small groups, fingers tracing the bomber's skin as if saying goodbye to a friend. They tested engines, listened to the steady heartbeat of the big radials, each pulse a promise and a warning. Officers moved like ghosts between compartments, passing clipped commands. The carrier's crew learned new rhythms, blackout drills, extra lookouts, silent watches. Funnels billowed steam. Huskies and seamen hauled lines. The Hornet rode the waves with the nervous strength of a beast, carrying something too precious to name. Nearby, escort ships steamed in protective patterns. Destroyers kept watch for enemy submarines. Cruisers watched the horizon for planes. Radio silence was law. If anyone transmitted by mistake, the consequences could be disaster. Every sonar ping and radar sweep became a heartbeat in the tense ocean night. On deck, the sight of the bombers was surreal. The B-25s were wide, heavy machines designed for long fields and long missions, not the narrow steel of a carrier. They sat close together, wings almost touching, their propellers bound, their bomb bays loaded and their extra fuel tanks tucked into every spare corner. Men on deck moved carefully, as if a single wrong step could start a chain reaction that ended the mission before it began. Families and dockworkers who knew something were kept at a distance. Farewells had been hurried and private. There were letters folded into pockets, photographs taped inside flight helmets, and small tokens tucked away in flight suits. Men said curt goodbyes and tried to laugh, but there was a hardness in their faces that didn't fade. When the Hornet finally slipped her moorings and moved to open water, the tone changed. The carrier shifted from preparation to motion. The engines warmed. The deck throbbed with life. Sailors found stations. Pilots climbed into cockpits and checked instruments one last time. Chains rattled as the ship rolled and the deck changed angles. It was a moving, dangerous ballet as the task force headed west. The sun slid down and left a narrow ribbon of orange on the water. Men watched the horizon, some praying, some staring at their hands. There was no ceremony. There were no speeches. Only the quiet understanding that whatever lay ahead would be the test of all they had trained for. And behind them smoke rings of home. Fading fast was a country waiting for news. Ahead thousands of miles of dark water, enemy air, and a plan that could change the war. The Hornet sailed on, carrying men and machines toward a gamble that the world would remember. Night over the North Pacific was a soft black sheet. Stars watched. Waves whispered. But danger moved beneath the calm. A small Japanese patrol boat, nothing majestic, just a cutter on routine watch, chugged through the dark. Its crew scanned for enemy ships, for subs, for anything out of place. They spotted a faint silhouette on the horizon. Something didn't belong. A large ship and strange shapes on its deck. On the Hornet, sailors were tense but hopeful. On the patrol boat, a lookout squinted through spyglass and called the deck. Engines slowed. The cutter crept closer. The man with the binoculars saw what no one expected. American medium bombers sitting on a carrier. The sight made no sense. Bombers belonged to airfields, not to decks. The patrol boat sent a report. A single radio transmission on the open air. In the cold silence of the ocean, that message was a spark in dry tinder. It reached Japanese headquarters. Within hours, search planes and destroyers were ordered to sweep the area. The task force had tried to be invisible, but the ocean is full of eyes. A small mistake became a dangerous ripple. The Hornet and her escorts were suddenly racing a clock they had not planned for. In the carrier's control room, officers grabbed maps. Men who had trained for secrecy now faced the worst-case scenario. Discovery. The mission's carefully plotted timeline unraveled. If the task force was sighted, the launch point would be forced farther from Japan. Bombers would have to fly a longer route and use more fuel. The margin for error would shrink to nothing. Doolittle and his staff met in a cramped space below deck. Faces were lit by red lamps. Voices were low. They measured options quickly. Turn back, abort, or launch immediately. Even though the planned distance would be greater, every choice carried deadly consequences. Doolittle made his decision where pressure was highest. He understood the stakes. Delay meant higher chance of detection and possible attack on the fleet. Launching early meant the planes would have to fly even farther to reach China. Men might run out of fuel. Some might crash at sea. Some might be captured in enemy territory. He chose to press forward. He ordered the launch. It was a brutal, honest decision accept certain risk to preserve the mission's chance. Men would take off sooner, in worse conditions, with less fuel. It was a gamble within a gamble. On deck, engines fired up sooner than planned. Men tightened straps and barked final checks. Pilots who had practiced exact timing now faced shorter runways and rougher seas. The ocean smelled of salt, oil, and pressure. Men gripped controls with white knuckles. Some said short prayers. Others stared at the horizon, where the first faint light of dawn would soon appear. The Japanese patrol boat that had sent the alert was far away now, but its message had changed everything. A single blink of detection had forced a chain of decisions that would stretch courage to the breaking point. The Hornet's crew felt the weight of the choice. They watched the deck for the first bomber to roll. In less than an hour, 16 men and machines would launch into history sooner, farther, and with thinner chances than anyone had planned. Discovery had come like a cold wind. It could have ended the mission. Instead, it sharpened resolve. The gamble had become raw. the cost higher, and the courage required absolute. The message from the Japanese patrol boat hit like a hammer. The mission's carefully built plan, months of secrecy, training, and precision timing was shattered in seconds. Now Doolittle stood at the edge of an impossible choice: wait and risk Japanese ships or aircraft closing in on the Hornet, or launch immediately hundreds of miles earlier than planned. Either way, the odds were brutal. If he delayed, the task force might be discovered and attacked. A single Japanese strike could sink the Hornet, drown her crew, and erase the mission before it began. But if he ordered the bombers to launch now, the crews would face an even greater challenge. The distance to Japan was now stretched. Fuel calculations no longer matched. Even if they hit Tokyo, would they have enough to reach China? The numbers said no. Logic said no. But morale, the spirit of a wounded nation, demanded yes. Doolittle knew his men were ready. They had trained for months, stripping bombers of weight, mastering short takeoffs, memorizing every detail of this plan. They trusted him. And now he had to decide. He gathered the pilots. In the dim light of the carrier's briefing room, voices were hushed but steady. Maps showed the new distances. Fuel gauges were sketched in red. He told them the truth. We'll have to launch early. The risk is higher. We may not make it to China. But the mission goes forward. No man refused, not one. They nodded, straightened, adjusted flight jackets. A few smiled grimly, as if the impossible had only sharpened their resolve. Doolittle himself would fly the first bomber. That was his promise. If the gamble failed, he would not watch it fail from the safety of a deck. He would be in the air, in the same danger as his men. That decision bound the crews tighter than any order could. The deck crew rushed to prepare. Chains unfastened. Engines roared alive, coughing smoke and flame into the gray dawn. The Hornet pitched in the waves, but the deck became a runway in waiting. Every foot of steel mattered. Sailors crowded the rails to watch. They knew they were seeing history, men about to ride machines not meant for this place, about to attempt the impossible. Many of those sailors whispered to one another, "These men may never come back." Doolittle climbed into his bomber, checked his instruments, and gave the signal. His face was calm, but his mind carried the full weight of the gamble. If they failed, America's morale might sink lower than after Pearl Harbor. If they succeeded, they would shock the world. There was no middle ground. As the first bomber's engines thundered, every eye on deck turned forward. The deck stretched short, the ocean churned beyond. There was no room for hesitation. Doolittle pushed the throttle forward. At that moment, he wasn't just a commander. He was the man carrying America's answer to Pearl Harbor on his shoulders. And he was betting everything on a single, impossible flight. The sea rolled heavy beneath the Hornet. Waves slammed against her bow. The deck rose and dipped, never steady, never kind. And on that restless steel runway sat 16 bombers, machines that did not belong on a carrier. The order came. It was time. First in line was Doolittle himself. His B-25 groaned as the engines fired, coughing smoke, then catching with a deep, thunderous roar. Propellers blurred into spinning halos. The ship trembled as if sharing the tension of the men on board. Sailors lined the rails. They had cleared every inch of deck space for this launch. Even then, the runway was too short, the bombers too heavy. The margin for error was razor thin. If a plane failed to lift in time, it would plunge into the ocean, swallowed by waves before rescue could reach. Everyone knew it. No one spoke it aloud. Doolittle gave the signal. Brakes released. His bomber lunged forward, nose low, wheels bouncing against the uneven deck. The ship's bow dipped into a swell, and for a heartbeat, it looked like disaster. But just as the deck tilted down, Doolittle pulled back. The bomber caught the rising air, lifting off the steel and into the gray morning sky. A cheer erupted across the deck. Relief, awe, a sense that they had just witnessed the impossible. But the mission was only beginning. Behind Doolittle, 15 more crews waited, each man strapped in sweat-soaking flight suits despite the cold. They had watched the first plane succeed, but success did not erase fear. Engines started, roaring like war drums. One by one, the bombers rolled forward, each facing the same deadly challenge. The second plane wobbled on takeoff, dipping dangerously close to the waves before clawing upward into the air. The third nearly clipped the deck's edge, but its wings caught lift at the last possible second. Every launch was a gamble, every second a test. On deck, sailors stood frozen, hands clenched. Each successful liftoff was met with shouts and fists raised. Each close call drew gasps and prayers. The deck crew knew if even one bomber failed, the mission would falter and morale would break. But none failed. One by one, All 16 bombers roared down the deck and rose into the air. Against all odds, every single one took flight. From below, the sight was staggering. Giant bombers, meant for long runways and steady ground, now flew off a pitching carrier deck in the middle of the Pacific. It was a scene no one had believed possible until they saw it with their own eyes. The Hornet, now empty of her strange cargo, steamed onward. Her mission, in a sense, was complete. But for the men in those 16 planes, the mission was only beginning. They had left the safety of steel behind. Ahead lay hours of flight, enemy skies, and uncertain landings. But for now, in that moment above the waves, history had been made. 16 B-25 bombers, impossible machines on an impossible deck, were airborne. And America's answer to Pearl Harbor was on its way. Engines drummed steady, for propellers each beating the sky. 16 bombers spread out in formation, their bellies heavy with bombs, their tanks stretched thin with extra fuel. Below them, the Pacific rolled vast and endless. Ahead of them, Japan. The flight was long, longer now than any of them had expected. Launching hundreds of miles early had turned every minute in the air into a knife-edge gamble. Fuel gauges became the crew's constant enemy. Needles ticked down faster than planned. Each man knew what that meant: less margin for error, less chance of reaching China after the mission. Weather did not help. Thick clouds swept in, gray and merciless. Some planes plunged through sheets of rain. Others were tossed by winds that clawed at wings and tested control. Pilots wrestled with yokes, engines straining against the storm. Every bump rattled nerves. Every gust threatened to push them off course. Inside the cockpits, the men spoke little. Concentration was everything. Navigators hunched over charts, calculating drift, checking compasses, adjusting headings. Pilots stole quick glances at photographs taped to their dashboards. Wives, children, families waiting back home before fixing eyes back on the horizon. Gunners scanned the skies, not just for clouds, but for enemies. Enemy patrols were the shadow always lurking. Japanese ships crisscrossed the seas. Fighter patrols prowled the air. Any encounter could mean disaster. The bombers were too far from support, too far from rescue. If caught, they would have to fight alone. Each crew knew that one radio call from a patrol plane could bring fighters swarming down on them. But luck, skill, and the vastness of the ocean worked in their favor. Hours passed with only the endless gray sea below and the endless gray sky above. It was monotony layered with fear. Every mile closer to Japan felt like both a victory and a tightening rope. Pilots passed the time by talking softly to one another through headsets. Some cracked dry jokes. Others said nothing, lost in their own thoughts. The gunners shifted restlessly, eyes always outward. The bomb bays were quiet but heavy with promise. And through it all, the fuel problem grew heavier. Needles dipped closer to empty. Crews did quick math in their heads: how much fuel left, how far still to go. Many knew the truth. They might not have enough to make it home. They pressed on anyway. At moments, the clouds broke through the haze. They saw the faint outline of land, the coast of Japan. The first glimpse jolted every man awake. Months of training, weeks of secrecy, days of sailing, hours of tension, and now, finally, the target was real. They tightened formation, engines thundered stronger, cockpits went silent again. Ahead were cities alive with lights and people who thought themselves untouchable. The crews leaned forward in their seats, hands gripping controls, eyes fixed on the rising land. They were almost there. History was waiting just beyond the horizon. Tokyo, April 18, 1942. A quiet morning turned into thunder. The Japanese capital had lived with the belief of safety. The empire had stretched far into the Pacific. The ocean itself was thought to be an unbreakable wall. No enemy plane could possibly reach Tokyo. That was the promise leaders had given their people then. Out of the clouds, American bombers appeared. Doolittle led the charge. His B-25 droned over rooftops and factory chimneys, flying so low that citizens below could see the stars and stripes on the wings. Windows rattled, streets froze. People stared upward, stunned, as foreign aircraft carved across their skies. Bomb bay doors opened. Explosives fell. The first detonations tore into Tokyo's industrial district's warehouses, factories, fuel depots. Flames and smoke curled upward as steel cracked and glass shattered. Moments later, more bombs thundered down on Yokohama, then Kobe, then Nagoya. The targets were military and industrial dockyards, supply centers, shipbuilding facilities. But the psychological target was something larger: Japan's belief that it was untouchable. The raids were fast, precise, and shocking. Sirens wailed across the cities. Anti-aircraft guns scrambled into action. spitting black puffs into the sky. Searchlights probed the clouds, but the bombers were already there, already dropping, already gone. Japanese fighters tried to respond, but the attack had come so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that defenses lagged behind. On the ground, civilians ran through smoke-choked streets. Mothers grabbed children. Shopkeepers bolted doors. Factory workers dropped tools and scattered. No one could believe what they were seeing. American bombers, here, in the very heart of the empire. For the Japanese military, the raid was a humiliation. They had assured their people that Tokyo and the homeland were safe. Pearl Harbor had been their moment of triumph. Now, in less than 5 months, America had answered not with a small raid, but with fire raining from the sky over the emperor's own cities. For the American crews, the bombing was brief but unforgettable. They flew low, almost skimming rooftops, threading between smoke and gunfire. They saw startled faces looking up from streets and gardens. They heard flak burst close, rattling fuselages and punching holes in wings. Yet they pressed on, dropping every bomb they carried. It wasn't just destruction they delivered. It was a message to Japan. You are not safe. A message to America. We can strike back. As the last bombs fell, the crews pulled their planes higher, banking away from the cities. The smoke rose behind them, marking their path like dark scars across the skyline. They had done the unthinkable, but the mission was only half complete. Ahead lay the hardest part, escaping across hostile territory, flying on fumes, and finding a way to land or survive in China. Still, in that moment over Tokyo, the impossible had been achieved. The wall had been broken, and the world would never forget the sight of American bombers over Japan's capital in broad daylight. The bombs had fallen, but the destruction itself was limited. A few factories burned, warehouses were shattered, and fires licked the sky. In terms of military value, the raid had done only modest damage, but in terms of psychology it was an earthquake. For the Japanese people, the raid tore apart the illusion of safety. Leaders had promised that the home islands were untouchable, shielded by the vast Pacific Ocean and the reach of the Imperial Navy. The capital itself was supposed to be a fortress beyond reach. Yet in a single morning, American bombers had proven otherwise. Civilians stood in the streets of Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya, staring at smoke rising from their own neighborhoods. Mothers clutched children tighter. Workers whispered rumors in factories. Teachers calmed classrooms shaken by explosions. The shock was not just from the sound of bombs, it was from the realization that the war could now reach their homes. Fear spread faster than fire. If bombers could reach Tokyo once, when would they return? If Americans could strike from the sky, where else might they land? Panic sparked small evacuations. Blackout drills grew stricter, and people began to look up with unease at every distant drone of an aircraft. The military, too, felt the humiliation deeply. The raid was not massive, but it was public. It exposed gaps in Japanese defenses. It showed that their naval screen, their air patrols, their early warning systems all had failed. The Imperial Navy had won stunning victories across Asia and the Pacific, but now, for the first time, they looked vulnerable. Leaders in Tokyo were furious. How had American bombers crossed the ocean? From where had they launched? Many assumed they must have come from secret bases in China or Russia. Few believed the truth that they had taken off from an aircraft carrier. When that fact was confirmed later, the shock doubled. The Americans had not only struck the capital, they had done it with a daring method no one thought possible. For the Japanese government, the embarrassment was severe. They had boasted to their people about unstoppable expansion and total control. Now, they were forced to admit that the enemy could reach them. That humiliation fed anger. Anger at the Americans, of course, but also anger that led to brutal reprisals against civilians in occupied China, whom they suspected of aiding the raiders. Thousands would pay the price for the shock delivered in Tokyo. For America, the psychological effect was the exact opposite. The raid gave hope. Headlines back home shouted of the bold strike. People cheered in theaters when newsreels showed bombers taking off. Morale, which had sunk after Pearl Harbor, surged. The raid didn't cripple Japan, but it proved that America could fight back. The contrast was stark. Minimal physical destruction, but maximum psychological power. Japan's sense of invincibility was cracked. America's spirit was lifted. In war, bombs don't just break buildings. They break confidence or rebuild it. And on that April day, the sound of falling bombs over Tokyo changed the way both nations saw the war ahead. With Tokyo behind them, the crews turned their eyes west. But victory in the air gave way to terror in the cockpit. The raid was only half the battle. Now came the impossible part: escape. The B-25 bombers had launched hundreds of miles earlier than planned, burning precious fuel before even reaching Japan. Each man knew the math. The tanks would run dry long before they reached safety. Still, they pressed on, throttles steady, engines roaring against the winds. Storm clouds rolled across the East China Sea. Sheets of rain lashed at the planes. Navigation grew difficult. Visibility dropped, and the fuel gauges crept lower with every mile. Some crews prayed. Others scribbled hurried notes to loved ones. Silence often filled the cockpits, broken only by the drone of engines and the unspoken question: would they make it? As night fell, the reality became undeniable. They would not reach their intended bases. The fuel was gone. One by one, crews prepared for the inevitable bailout or crash land. Some bombers plummeted into the sea, their crews scrambling into rafts as waves swallowed the wreckage. Others skimmed over the dark Chinese countryside before crash landing in rice paddies or mountain valleys. Metal tore, wings snapped, and flames lit the night as the exhausted men crawled free. A few survived only by parachuting into the unknown, their silk chutes glowing white in the stormy sky. For many, safety was still far away. They had landed not in friendly airstrips, but in hostile, occupied territory. Japanese forces scoured the land, hunting for the raiders. Some crews were captured, tortured, and executed. Others were hidden by brave Chinese civilians, who risked everything to shelter the Americans. Entire villages would later face brutal reprisals for their kindness. Doolittle himself bailed out into darkness, landing in a field far from his men. When he regrouped with survivors, he feared the mission had been a failure. Every plane was lost. Crews were scattered, wounded, or captured. He was certain he would face court-martial for leading his men into disaster. But in truth, the escape, though costly, had cemented the raid's legend. Out of 80 men, most survived, many aided by the Chinese resistance. A handful never returned, their fate sealed in prisons or unmarked graves. Yet even in escape, their courage echoed. They had flown farther than fuel allowed, struck deeper than logic said possible, and endured the terrifying plunge into enemy-held lands. The journey back was not one of triumphal parades, but of shattered wings and desperate survival. And yet, it was this brutal escape, the sight of bombers vanishing into storms, of crews stumbling through rice paddies, of men refusing to surrender, that made the Doolittle Raid more than a mission. It became a story of endurance. The raid had begun with a gamble. It ended with a desperate flight into the unknown. And though the bombers fell from the sky, the spirit of the men who flew them did not. When the last engines went silent and the bombers fell from the sky, the story of the Doolittle Raiders was far from over. Their fates would be written not in the air, but on the ground, in captivity, in hiding, and in the kindness of strangers. Some crews never made it out of their planes. They crashed hard, trapped in flaming wreckage or swallowed by the sea. For those who survived the crash, a new struggle began: survival in hostile territory. In the Chinese countryside, terrified villagers rushed to the wrecks. And yet, instead of turning the Americans over to Japanese troops, many chose compassion. Farmers hid the airmen in their homes. Doctors treated their wounds with what little supplies they had. Families gave them food, clothes, and directions through the mountains, all while knowing the terrible price they might pay if discovered. Entire villages were later massacred by Japanese forces for helping the raiders. Still, the Chinese people had made their choice to protect strangers who had come from the sky. But not every crew was so fortunate. Some landed in areas already controlled by Japanese soldiers. These men were quickly captured, beaten, starved, and paraded as propaganda. Their suffering was brutal. 8 of the captured airmen were put on trial by the Japanese as war criminals. 3 were executed. 1 died in prison from neglect. The others endured years of solitary confinement, torture, and humiliation until liberation finally came long after the war had shifted tides. Others met a different fate. A few crews, low on fuel, diverted to the Soviet Union, hoping for sanctuary. Instead, they found themselves detained. Though the Soviets did not hand them over to Japan, they kept the men under guard, interned in remote camps, until they eventually managed to escape months later. For Jimmy Doolittle, who believed the mission had failed, the fate of his men weighed heavily. He had expected disgrace, believing he had lost all 16 bombers and many crews in vain. But as reports trickled in, a different story emerged. Of the 80 men who launched from the USS Hornet, most had survived. They had endured prison camps, internment, hunger, and heartbreak, but they lived. The losses were heavy. Men had died in crashes, in Japanese prisons, and in villages burnt for sheltering them. But the sacrifice was not in vain. The courage of the raiders and the compassion of the Chinese people became inseparable chapters of the same story. The raid had shown that war was not fought only in the skies. It was fought in the choices of villagers who risked death to save strangers. It was fought in prison cells where men held on to hope despite years of darkness. It was fought in the loyalty of crews who stayed together until the end. The fate of the Doolittle Raiders was harsh, tragic, and yet profoundly human. Some never came home. Others carried scars for life. But together, they became symbols of sacrifice, endurance, and the price of daring to attempt the impossible. When Jimmy Doolittle finally touched down on Chinese soil, crash landing his own bomber and barely escaping with his life, his first thought was not victory. It was failure. 16 bombers had launched from the USS Hornet. None had returned. Every aircraft was lost. Crews were scattered across China, captured, missing, or dead. The plan that had seemed so daring, so audacious, had ended in wreckage. For a commander who had gambled everything, the weight was crushing. Doolittle believed he had let his country down. He was certain the mission would be judged a disaster. The loss of every plane, the death and capture of his men, and the uncertainty of the raid's impact weighed heavily on his conscience. In his own words, he was convinced he would be court-martialed, stripped of rank, and disgraced. The guilt ran deep. Doolittle had handpicked his crews. He had trained them, inspired them, and led them. Many had called it a suicide mission from the beginning, but he had believed it could work. Now, as he thought of his men suffering in Japanese prisons or lying dead in fields and mountains, he felt he had betrayed that trust. As the days passed, reports trickled in. Villagers who had seen the bombers fall confirmed that some crews had survived. Others relayed word of capture. With each message, Doolittle's emotions swung between hope and despair. But the guilt never left him. He believed his daring gamble had cost too many lives for too little gain. What Doolittle could not yet know was how the raid had shaken Japan, and how it had electrified America. To him, all that mattered was the toll on his men. He carried that burden alone, replaying every decision, launching early, pressing forward despite the risks, choosing a mission that offered no way back. Each memory cut deeper. He spoke little of triumph. Instead, he muttered of disgrace. His colleagues later remembered how he prepared himself mentally for the worst. In his mind, when he finally faced his superiors, he expected not medals, but punishment. It is one of history's great ironies. While the world saw Doolittle as a hero, he saw himself as a failure. His name would soon become synonymous with courage. But in those first days after the raid, all he felt was guilt. That weight would shape him. It reminded him that boldness carried consequences, that leadership meant carrying not only glory but grief. And though recognition and honors would later follow, Doolittle never forgot the price his men paid for the man who had dared to strike Japan. The greatest battle was not fought in the skies above Tokyo, it was fought within himself. In the quiet moments after the raid, when guilt and doubt overshadowed the roar of engines and the thunder of bombs. Back in the United States, the mood was very different from Jimmy Doolittle's private despair. While he sat in China, weighed down by guilt and convinced the mission was a failure, news of the raid began to spread across America, and it lit the nation like wildfire. Just months earlier, the country had been reeling. Pearl Harbor was still a fresh wound. Battles in the Pacific had gone badly. The Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. For ordinary Americans, fear and doubt hung heavy in the air. Could the United States really stand against such a powerful enemy? Then came the headlines. American bombers strike Tokyo. The news was almost unbelievable. For the first time in history, enemy bombs had fallen on Japan's home islands. The same nation that had boasted of being untouchable had now been struck in its very heart. Across the country, factories cheered. Families huddled around radios, listening with wide eyes as announcers described the daring raid. Newspapers sold out in minutes. Men and women who had felt only despair after Pearl Harbor now felt something else. Pride. It wasn't about the damage. Americans knew the raid had been small. They knew it hadn't crippled Japan's industry or destroyed its military. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the message. America could strike back. The enemy was not invincible. In towns and cities, people celebrated. Parades honored the raiders. Soldiers training for war stood taller, inspired by the audacity of the mission. For the first time since the war had begun, victory no longer seemed impossible. Politicians, too, seized the moment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, careful not to reveal the details of the mission, announced simply that the attack had been launched from Shangri-La, a fictional place from a popular novel. The mystery only added to the excitement. Even abroad, the raid made waves. Allied nations took heart, seeing proof that America was not broken, but fighting back with daring and imagination. The Japanese, meanwhile, were stunned. Their leaders had promised their people that no enemy could touch the homeland. Now, those promises were broken, and yet, the man at the center of it all, Jimmy Doolittle, had no idea of the impact. While America celebrated, he braced for disgrace. Only later would he learn the truth, that his mission had been the spark America so desperately needed for a battered nation. The raid was more than a military action. It was a symbol, a turning point in spirit if not in strategy. From factories to farms, from soldiers to schoolchildren, Americans felt hope again. The Doolittle Raid had not destroyed Japan, but it had awakened America. And sometimes, in war, morale can be as powerful a weapon as bombs. For Japan, the Doolittle Raid was more than a shock, it was an insult. The mighty empire, which had stretched across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with lightning speed, had promised its people that the homeland was untouchable. But now, American bombers had proven otherwise. The humiliation was unbearable. Tokyo burned not just from the small bombs dropped, but from the fury of its leaders. Japanese pride had been wounded, and with it came rash decisions that would change the course of the entire war. The first reaction was panic. If American bombers could reach Tokyo once, they could do it again. Japan's leaders assumed that another, larger raid might be just around the corner. They scrambled to defend the homeland. Anti-aircraft guns were pulled from other fronts. Fighter squadrons were reassigned. Entire units that might have fought in the Pacific Islands were instead kept close to Japan, guarding the skies that suddenly felt vulnerable. But the deeper impact was strategic. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was enraged. To him, the raid was proof that America had to be crushed quickly, before its strength could grow. He devised a bold plan: lure the U.S. Navy into a decisive battle, destroy its carriers, and regain control of the Pacific. The chosen target was Midway Atoll, a tiny island, but one that sat like a stepping stone toward Hawaii. Yamamoto believed that by threatening Midway, the Americans would be forced into battle. Once they came, his superior fleet would annihilate them. What Yamamoto did not know was that the Americans had broken parts of his naval code. U.S. intelligence already suspected Midway was the target. When the Japanese sailed, the Americans were ready. The results were catastrophic for Japan. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, just 2 months after the Doolittle Raid, 4 of Japan's powerful aircraft carriers were sunk. These were the very carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Thousands of Japan's best pilots and crew were lost. The Doolittle Raid had not destroyed Japanese factories or crippled their war machine, but it had forced them into reckless decisions. In trying to erase the shame of the raid, Japan walked straight into a trap that permanently shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. Historians often call Midway the turning point of the war against Japan, and in many ways, it was a direct consequence of those 16 bombers taking off from the USS Hornet. For Japan, the raid had planted seeds of fear and pride-driven overreaction. For America, it had bought time, boosted morale, and helped pave the way for one of the most decisive victories in naval history. A few bombs over Tokyo had changed everything. What seemed like a symbolic gesture had rippled outward, shaping strategies, battles, and ultimately, the fate of nations. The Doolittle Raid began as a desperate gamble, a mission many believed would end in disaster. 16 bombers, 80 men, no way back. On paper, it looked like suicide, but in history, it became something far greater. In Tokyo, fires burned and alarms wailed. Japan, once confident in its shield of distance, realized for the first time that the enemy could reach its heart. The myth of invincibility was shattered. In Washington, factories, and small towns across America, the news of the raid spread like lightning. A battered nation, still haunted by Pearl Harbor, stood taller. Hope replaced despair. Pride replaced fear. Yes, the damage was limited. Japan's war machine remained strong, but the raid had never been about bombs alone. It was about a message. A message to Japan: you are not untouchable. A message to America: we can fight back. A message to the world: the tide will turn. For the men who flew the mission, the price was heavy. Some never returned. Some suffered in prisons. Villages in China paid dearly for their courage in sheltering the airmen. The cost of the raid was written in sacrifice. Yet from that sacrifice came a ripple that changed the Pacific War. Japan's rage led them into a trap at Midway, where 4 of their great carriers were lost forever. America, fueled by renewed spirit, pushed forward with determination. Step by step, island by island, the road to victory began. And at the center of it all was a man who thought he had failed Jimmy Doolittle. Expecting disgrace, he returned home to cheers, medals, and honor. He had not just led a raid. He had lit a fire in the hearts of millions. The Doolittle Raid was proof that sometimes history turns not on massive battles or endless armies, but on daring ideas. It showed that courage, even in the face of impossible odds, can reshape the destiny of nations. Picture it, 16 bombers rising from the deck of the USS Hornet. Waves crashing, engines roaring, crews bracing for a mission with no return. Against the storm, against the odds, they flew into legend. In the end, the raid was more than a strike on Tokyo. It was a promise to the fallen at Pearl Harbor, to the soldiers on distant fronts, to a world watching in fear that America would not bow, would not break, and would not stop until victory was won. A mission that began in doubt ended in history. What seemed like suicide became a spark. What seemed impossible became reality. And the message still echoes through time. America could strike back anywhere,